My 18-month-old son Oliver suddenly became terrified of diaper changes at his $2,000 a month elite daycare, so I hid a camera in his diaper bag and discovered they were drugging all the babies with Benadryl to keep them unconscious for 8 hours straight, while one teenage girl watched 60 toddlers. But when I went to police, they warned me to stop because the owner, Mrs. Chen's sister, ran the state licensing department, and her husband was on city council until Oliver overdosed, and we united 200 parents to expose their 3 daycare centers where they'd been sedating infants for years. When my son Oliver turned 18 months old, he suddenly became terrified of diaper changes. This was the same little boy who used to giggle and play peekaboo during changes just 2 weeks ago. Now he'd cry and try to roll away the moment I reached for his diaper. Naturally, I asked the daycare if anything had happened. "Oh, he's just entering his independent phase. Totally normal," Miss Katie assured me with her perfect smile. I smiled back, wanting to believe her. I didn't think much about it until Oliver started refusing his bottles too. He'd push them away and cry, which was strange because he'd always loved his milk. I remember asking if they were having trouble feeding him at daycare. "Not at all. He drinks everything right up," Miss Katie said cheerfully. That's when I got truly suspicious. I started looking at Oliver's behavior more carefully, and I realized his worst days were always daycare days. He'd come home exhausted, way too exhausted for a toddler. He'd sleep from 5 p.m. straight through to morning, but on weekends, he'd be his normal, energetic self. That's when I tested them in a subtle manner. I'm thinking of switching Oliver to half days. I think full days might be too much for— "Oh no, we don't offer half days," Miss Katie interrupted quickly. I stared at her. "But your website says you do?" I asked. Silence. She fumbled with some papers. "That's outdated. We're fully booked anyway." She turned away before I could ask more questions. By now I was extremely worried. This was Sunshine Academy, the most expensive and highest rated daycare in town. They had perfect reviews, waiting lists, and charged $2,000 a month. Every parent raved about them. That week, I bought a tiny USB camera online. I know recording was probably illegal, but I truly felt like I had no choice. I had a gut feeling Oliver was in danger. I hid it in his diaper bag between some burp cloths. My hands shook as I dropped him off that morning. When I watched the footage that night, I wanted to throw up. They had given Oliver something in his bottle that made him drowsy. Within 30 minutes, he was unconscious in his crib, and he stayed there all day, 8 hours straight. No diaper changes, no feedings, no interaction, just sleeping in his own waste. I could see at least 20 other toddlers in the same room with only one teenage girl watching them. She spent the entire time on her phone. My hands started shaking as I watched more footage. The owner, Mrs. Chen, came in briefly to take photos of herself reading to empty chairs. She posted these on their Facebook page later that day. "Another wonderful story time at Sunshine Academy," the caption read. I quietly retrieved the camera and planted it in different spots over the next week. What I discovered made me want to scream. They were putting Benadryl in all the bottles to keep the children sedated. The kitchen was disgusting, with mold on the walls and expired milk being poured into bottles. I saw them serving food that had been sitting out for hours. They had 3 staff watching 60 children but reported a 1-to-4 ratio to the state. Every inspection sheet on their wall was forged. What do you even do when you realize dozens of babies are being drugged? The first thing I did was take the footage to the police. The officer looked uncomfortable as soon as I mentioned Sunshine Academy. "Ma'am, you recorded this illegally. That's a crime. I'd be careful about making accusations against the Chens." That's when I learned the truth. Mrs. Chen's sister ran the state child care licensing department. Her husband sat on the city council that awarded daycare contracts. Her brother-in-law was the district attorney. And so, I did the only thing I could think of. I started documenting everything while pretending everything was normal. I bought more cameras and recruited 2 other worried mothers. We took turns planting them and downloading footage. We documented every falsified record, every violation, every drugged child. I started requesting Oliver's daily reports and saving them, noting how they claimed he ate foods we'd never sent. I took photos of his diaper rashes that proved he wasn't being changed. I saved every happy Facebook post they made while children suffered. Unfortunately, this evidence gathering was cut short by what is now the worst day of my life, Thursday. Oliver came home from daycare unable to wake up properly. He was breathing but completely unresponsive. I rushed him to the emergency room where his blood test showed dangerous levels of diphenhydramine. The doctor pulled me aside looking grave. "This is consistent with a significant OD. Has he had access to any medications?" With trembling hands, I showed her a portion of the footage. I watched her face turn white as she saw them putting it in his bottle. "Oh my God," she whispered. "We need to test all the children." That's when she made the call that changed everything. The doctor immediately called Child Protective Services while I sat in the hospital room holding Oliver's limp hand. Within an hour, 2 investigators arrived with serious expressions and notebooks ready. I showed them everything on my phone, the videos, the photos, the documentation we'd collected over the past weeks. They exchanged meaningful glances as they watched staff members preparing bottles with crushed pills. One investigator stepped out to make calls while the other stayed with me, asking detailed questions about Oliver's symptoms and behavior changes. I could hear snippets of the phone conversation from the hallway, mentions of emergency protocols and immediate intervention needed. More parents started arriving at the emergency room with their toddlers. Word had spread somehow, maybe through the investigators' calls or maybe just parental instinct. I recognized several faces from daycare pickup, mothers I'd exchanged polite smiles with but never really talked to. Now we all shared the same horrified expression as nurses drew blood samples from our drowsy children. The test results came back one by one. Elevated diphenhydramine levels in every single child. Some dangerously high like Oliver's, others showing chronic exposure over time. The emergency room transformed into controlled chaos as more families arrived, demanding their children be tested too. I overheard a nurse telling another parent that they'd already tested 15 children, all positive for the substance. The hospital administration called in extra staff to handle the surge. Social workers appeared to document each case while medical staff monitored the affected children. My phone buzzed with a text from one of the mothers who'd been helping me gather evidence. She was at the daycare trying to pick up her daughter early, but the doors were locked. Through the window, she could see staff members frantically shredding papers and emptying filing cabinets. Another parent had called to report seeing Mrs. Chen loading boxes into her car in the parking lot. The investigator returned to my room looking grim. She explained that they were coordinating with law enforcement for an immediate shutdown order, but it would take time to process. Meanwhile, children were still inside that building. The thought made my stomach turn. Oliver finally stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open briefly before closing again. The doctor assured me his vitals were stable, but he needed needed continued monitoring. She mentioned that some children might experience withdrawal symptoms after chronic exposure to the sedatives. The word withdrawal made me want to scream. My baby was going through substance withdrawal because of a daycare. More disturbing details emerged as parents compared notes in the waiting room. One mother realized her daughter's recurring respiratory infections coincided with daycare attendance. Another connected her son's developmental delays to when he'd started at Sunshine Academy 6 months ago. We'd all been so trusting, so blind to what was happening right in front of us. The investigator asked if I had backups of all my evidence. I'd uploaded everything to cloud storage and given copies to the other 2 mothers, but now I worried it wasn't enough. Mrs. Chen had powerful connections. What if she found a way to make this all disappear? As if reading my thoughts, the investigator assured me that with this many affected children and hospital documentation, there was no covering it up, but her words felt hollow when I remembered the police officer's warning about the Chen family's influence. A commotion in the hallway caught our attention. Through the doorway, I saw Mrs. Chen herself, dressed in her usual professional attire, trying to push past security. She was demanding to speak with hospital administration, claiming there had been a terrible misunderstanding. Her voice carried that same fake sweetness she used when talking to parents. Security eventually escorted her out, but not before she made eye contact with me through the doorway. The look she gave me was pure venom, nothing like the warm smiles she'd perfected for drop-offs and pickups. In that moment, I knew this was far from over. The other mother who'd been helping me document everything arrived at the hospital with her laptop. She'd managed to download all our cloud files onto physical drives, creating multiple backups. We huddled together in the corner of the waiting room, going through everything we'd collected, making sure nothing was missing. The evidence was overwhelming when laid out systematically. Videos showing pills being crushed into formula, time-stamped footage of children lying unconscious for hours, photos of the filthy kitchen conditions, screenshots of fraudulent inspection certificates, records showing massive discrepancies between reported and actual child-to-staff ratios. What struck me most was how calculated it all was. This wasn't negligence or corner cutting. This was deliberate, systematic drugging of infants and toddlers for profit. They could take on more children than they could handle because unconscious babies don't need attention. The investigator took copies of everything, but I kept wondering about the children still at the daycare. It was past closing time now, but what about tomorrow? What about all the parents who didn't know yet? Some families hadn't brought their children to the hospital, either because they hadn't heard or didn't believe it could be true. Oliver's blood work showed improvement as the substances slowly left his system, but he remained lethargic and confused. The doctor explained that it could take days for him to fully recover, and we wouldn't know about potential long-term effects until later. The uncertainty was unbearable. Around midnight, another wave of parents arrived. Word had spread through social media and parent networks. The hospital set up a special intake area just for Sunshine Academy children. The numbers were staggering. Over 40 children tested, all showing traces of sedatives in their systems. I learned that Mrs. Chen had tried to access the daycare building, but found it sealed by authorities. She'd been seen making frantic phone calls in the parking lot before driving away. Her husband had been spotted at their house loading suitcases into their car. It seemed like they were preparing to run. The thought of them escaping made my blood boil. All those months of trusting them with our most precious babies, paying premium prices for what we thought was premium care. All those glowing reviews and recommendations had been built on drugged children and desperate parents who didn't know better. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to my doorstep. A process server handed me an envelope with a stern expression before walking away. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Mrs. Chen's attorney, threatening legal action if I continued spreading defamatory lies about Sunshine Academy. The letter claimed I was orchestrating a conspiracy to destroy their business, and demanded I retract all statements immediately. I sat at my kitchen table, hands trembling as I read through the legal jargon. They were threatening to sue me for everything I had. The letter mentioned specific details about the evidence I'd gathered, things only someone who'd seen our footage would know. My blood ran cold. How did they know exactly what we had documented? Oliver was still recovering at home, sleeping more than usual, but gradually returning to his normal self. I kept checking on him every few minutes, paranoid that the effects might suddenly worsen. The pediatrician had given us a detailed monitoring plan, but I couldn't shake the fear that we'd missed something. My phone rang constantly with calls from other parents. Some wanted to join our evidence-gathering efforts, while others were panicking about their own children's symptoms. I started keeping a notebook of every conversation, documenting which children had which symptoms and for how long. The pattern was undeniable. The longer children had attended Sunshine Academy, the more severe their issues. That afternoon, I met with the 2 mothers who'd been helping me gather evidence. We sat in my living room, laptops open, comparing notes. One of them, Sarah, looked exhausted. Her daughter had been at Sunshine Academy for 2 years and was showing significant developmental delays. The other mother, Lisa, had twin boys who'd only started 3 months ago. They were recovering faster than the long-term attendees. We decided to create a comprehensive timeline of everything we'd documented. Sarah worked on organizing the video evidence while Lisa compiled all the falsified documents we'd photographed. I focused on creating a master list of affected children and their symptoms. We needed to be systematic about this, especially now that legal threats were involved. As we worked, Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face went pale. Someone had been in her house while she was at the hospital with her daughter. Nothing was stolen, but her computer was missing and several drawers had been rifled through. She'd backed up the evidence files, but the violation made us all nervous. We immediately changed our strategy. Instead of keeping evidence in our homes, we'd use multiple cloud services and give copies to trusted friends outside the area. Lisa suggested we also mail physical copies to relatives in other states. It felt extreme, but Mrs. Chen's reach was becoming clearer by the hour. The doorbell rang, making us all jump. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as a former employee of Sunshine Academy, nervously glancing over her shoulder. She'd heard about what was happening and wanted to help. Her name was Maria, and she'd worked there for 6 months before quitting in disgust. Maria's information was invaluable. She confirmed everything we'd suspected and more. The drugging had been going on for at least 3 years. Mrs. Chen had specifically instructed staff to increase dosages for difficult children. They kept 2 sets of books, one for inspections and one real set. She'd taken photos of some documents before leaving, but had been too scared to do anything with them until now. She showed us the photos on her phone, spreadsheets detailing which children received which dosages, staff schedules showing they never met legal ratios, purchase orders for bulk Benadryl that far exceeded any legitimate need. Most disturbing were the notes about individual children, marking some as problems who needed extra management. Oliver's name was on that list. My hands shook as I saw the notation next to his name. Mother asks too many questions. Increased dose to ensure compliance. They'd been specifically targeting him because of my concerns. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. My questions had made things worse for my baby. Maria agreed to let us copy all her evidence but refused to go to authorities herself. She was terrified of retaliation. Mrs. Chen had connections everywhere and had already threatened former employees who'd spoken up. One had their car vandalized. Another lost their new job after Mrs. Chen made phone calls. The intimidation was real and effective. We spent hours documenting everything Maria shared. She revealed that Mrs. Chen's sister didn't just run the licensing department. She actively coached Sunshine Academy on how to pass inspections. They'd receive advance notice of any visits and would bring in extra staff just for those days. The children would be kept awake and engaged during inspections, then drugged immediately after inspectors left. As Maria prepared to leave, she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Chen had been at the daycare that morning, before authorities arrived. She'd been in the office with several staff members, and Maria had heard from a friend who still worked there that they'd been destroying evidence. Computer hard drives, paper files, even security camera footage, all gone. After Maria left, we sat in stunned silence. The scope of the operation was bigger than we'd imagined. This wasn't just negligence or cutting corners. It was a calculated system designed to maximize profit at the expense of helpless children, and now they were covering their tracks. Lisa's phone rang. It was her husband, frantic. Someone had called his workplace claiming Lisa was mentally unstable and making false accusations about a daycare. They'd suggested he might want to look into having her evaluated. The caller had been anonymous, but the threat was clear. Back off or we'll destroy your credibility. We decided to be more careful about our movements. Sarah suggested we vary our meeting locations and times. We couldn't let them intimidate us into silence, but we needed to be smart about protecting ourselves and our evidence. The children depending on us deserved nothing less. That evening, I received a call from another parent whose child attended Sunshine Academy. She was hysterical. Her son had been released from the hospital but was experiencing severe withdrawal symptoms. He couldn't sleep, wouldn't eat, and had been vomiting all day. The doctors were doing their best, but watching a 2-year-old go through substance withdrawal was heartbreaking. I gave her what comfort I could, sharing our pediatrician's advice and promising to add her son's case to our documentation. After hanging up, I sat beside Oliver's bed, watching him sleep. He was one of the lucky ones. We'd caught it before the damage became permanent. But how many children weren't so fortunate? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Stop now or face consequences. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I screenshot it immediately and added it to our evidence file. The intimidation was escalating, but it only strengthened my resolve. They were scared, which meant we were on the right track. The next day brought a new challenge. I arrived at Oliver's pediatrician appointment to find our appointment had been canceled. The receptionist looked confused, saying someone had called claiming to be me and canceled all future appointments. It took an hour to sort out, but the message was clear. They were trying to interfere with Oliver's medical care. I started documenting everything more carefully. Every strange occurrence, every threat, every attempt at intimidation went into a detailed log. We were building a pattern of harassment that would be hard to dismiss, even with the Chen family's connections. Sarah called with disturbing news. She'd been contacted by a lawyer claiming to represent several Sunshine Academy employees. He was offering a settlement if she agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement and destroy all evidence. The amount was substantial, enough to cover her daughter's future therapy and medical needs. She was conflicted, and I couldn't blame her. We met at a park, watching our children play while we talked. Sarah's daughter struggled to keep up with the other kids, her movements sluggish from months of drugging. The settlement money could help her, but at what cost? How many other children would suffer if we stayed silent? Sarah ultimately decided to record the conversation with the lawyer. When she refused the settlement, he became aggressive, warning that Mrs. Chen had resources we couldn't imagine. He mentioned specific details about Sarah's life, her mortgage, her husband's job, even her daughter's medical history. The threat was implicit but clear. Lisa had been investigating the Chen family's connections. What she found was a web of influence throughout the city. Mrs. Chen's brother-in-law wasn't just the district attorney. He'd personally intervened in 2 previous complaints against Sunshine Academy. Her sister had fast-tracked their licensing renewals despite violations. Her husband's position on the city council had secured them prime real estate and tax breaks. But we also found cracks in their armor. Several former employees were willing to talk if we could guarantee their anonymity. Parents who'd withdrawn their children months ago were now realizing their kids' health improvements weren't coincidental. A pediatric nurse mentioned she'd been documenting unusual symptoms in Sunshine Academy children for over a year. We started building a network of allies, careful to verify everyone's identity and motives. The Chen family's intimidation tactics were backfiring. Instead of silencing us, they were revealing just how much they had to hide. Every threat, every attempt at interference added to our evidence of consciousness of guilt. One afternoon, while Oliver napped, I noticed a car parked across from my house. It had been there for hours, engine running occasionally. When I approached to get a closer look, it sped away. The same car appeared outside Sarah's house that evening and near Lisa's workplace the next day. We were being watched. We changed tactics again, using encrypted messaging apps and meeting in busy public places. We couldn't let paranoia paralyze us, but we had to be smart. The children affected by Sunshine Academy needed us to see this through, no matter how difficult it became. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A local health inspector reached out through Maria. He'd been pressured to overlook violations at Sunshine Academy for years, but was willing to talk off the record. His conscience had been eating at him, especially now that the scope of the harm was becoming clear. He revealed that every inspection report he'd filed noting violations had been altered before being officially recorded. His supervisor, who happened to be Mrs. Chen's cousin, would change failing grades to passing ones. He'd kept copies of his original reports at home, documentation that could prove the systematic cover-up. We met him at a coffee shop outside the city limits. He was nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder. He handed over a flash drive containing 3 years of original inspection reports. The violations were staggering. Expired food, inadequate staffing, unsafe conditions, missing medical records. All of it had been covered up. As we reviewed the reports, he mentioned something that made my stomach drop. Sunshine Academy wasn't the only daycare the Chen family operated. They had 2 other facilities in neighboring counties, operating under different names but with the same practices. The thought of how many children were being drugged across multiple locations was overwhelming. We decided to focus on Sunshine Academy first, first, but made note of the other locations for future investigation. The health inspector promised to testify if needed, though he feared for his job and safety. We assured him we'd protect his identity as long as possible. That night, Oliver woke screaming from a nightmare. He couldn't tell me what scared him, but he clung to me desperately. The pediatrician had warned that psychological effects might emerge as the substances left his system. My baby was traumatized, and the people responsible were still walking free. The intimidation escalated the next day. Lisa found her tires slashed in her workplace parking lot. Sarah received a letter threatening to report her to Child Protective Services for endangering her child with false medical treatments. I discovered someone had tried to access my bank accounts online. They were trying to destabilize our lives, make us too overwhelmed to continue. But their tactics had the opposite effect. Each attack made us more determined. We were careful, documenting everything, varying our routines, and protecting our evidence. We also started reaching out to parents from the other Sunshine Academy locations, warning them about what we'd discovered. The response was immediate and heartbreaking. Parents reported similar symptoms in their children: unexplained lethargy, developmental delays, behavioral changes after starting at the Chen family's daycares. The pattern was consistent across all locations. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a business model. We compiled everything into a comprehensive report: videos, documents, medical records, witness statements, evidence of intimidation, and cover-ups. It painted a clear picture of a criminal enterprise protected by a network of corrupt family members in positions of authority. But we still faced the challenge of finding someone with the power and willingness to act on it. A parent suggested contacting a journalist who'd exposed corruption in other cities. We were hesitant. Media attention could backfire, but we were running out of options. The local authorities were compromised, and the Chen family's intimidation was escalating. We needed someone outside their sphere of influence. Before we could decide, I received an unexpected visit. Mrs. Chen herself stood at my door, flanked by two large men. She maintained her fake smile, but her eyes were cold. She wanted to clear up this misunderstanding and suggested we discuss it inside. Every instinct screamed danger. I refused to let them in, standing firm in my doorway. Mrs. Chen dropped her pretense, warning that I was destroying the reputation of a business that served the community. She mentioned Oliver by name, noting how unfortunate it would be if his medical issues worsened. The threat was clear, even if the words were carefully chosen. I recorded the entire interaction on my phone, hidden in my pocket. When she realized I wouldn't be intimidated, her mask slipped completely. She hissed that I had no idea what I was starting and that my family would regret crossing hers. Then she left, but not before one of her companions made a point of photographing my house and car. The visit shook me, but it also revealed their desperation. They wouldn't risk such direct contact unless they were running out of options. Our evidence gathering was working. We were building a case they couldn't dismiss or cover up, and they knew it. That evening, we held an emergency meeting with all the parents who'd joined our cause. There were over 20 of us now, all with children affected by the Chen family's daycares. We shared the latest threats and discussed our next moves. The consensus was clear. We couldn't back down now. We decided to take a multi-pronged approach. Some parents would focus on gathering more evidence from the other daycare locations. Others would research the Chen family's business holdings and connections. A small group would work on protecting and organizing the evidence we'd already collected. Everyone had a role, and everyone was committed. As the meeting ended, one parent mentioned something that sparked a new idea. Her brother worked for the state health department, not the local one. He might be able to initiate an investigation that bypassed the Chen family's local connections. It was worth exploring, even if it meant starting the bureaucratic process from scratch. We also decided to create a support group for affected families. Beyond the investigation, parents needed help dealing with their children's recovery. We shared resources, doctor recommendations, and coping strategies. The Chen family had isolated us as individual victims, but together we were so much stronger. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Parents reported finding hidden cameras in the other daycare locations. More former employees came forward with horror stories. Medical professionals shared their concerns about the long-term effects of chronic Benadryl exposure in developing children. The evidence mountain grew daily, but so did the retaliation. Sarah's husband was suddenly laid off from his job. Lisa received notices about code violations on her property that didn't exist. My car insurance was mysteriously canceled. The Chen family was pulling every string they could, trying to pressure us into submission. I decided to stop playing defense. The Chen family thought they could intimidate us into silence, but they'd miscalculated. We had evidence, witnesses, and most importantly, we had each other. It was time to take the offensive. The next morning, I called every parent whose child had ever attended Sunshine Academy. Not just the ones already involved, but everyone I could find contact information for. Sarah and Lisa helped, dividing up old class lists and enrollment forms we'd photographed. We spent hours making calls, explaining what we'd discovered, urging parents to have their children tested. The response was overwhelming. Parents who'd withdrawn their children months or even years ago suddenly connected the dots. One mother broke down sobbing when she realized her son's speech delays might not be developmental after all. Another father admitted he'd always wondered why his daughter slept so much during her time at the daycare. We organized a meeting at a community center for that weekend. Over 60 parents showed up, many carrying medical records and their own documentation. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Children who'd thrived before enrollment becoming lethargic and delayed. Mysterious illnesses that cleared up after leaving. Behavioral changes that parents had blamed on themselves. During the meeting, a father I'd never met before stood up. He worked in IT and offered to create a secure website where we could upload all our evidence. Another parent, a nurse, volunteered to coordinate medical documentation. A mother who worked in accounting said she'd analyze the financial records we'd gathered. Everyone had something to contribute. Mrs. Chen must have gotten word about our meeting because the harassment intensified immediately. Sarah found a dead rat on her doorstep. Lisa's daughter's preschool received an anonymous call claiming Lisa was unstable. My own mailbox was stuffed with printed screenshots of my social media posts from years ago, circled in red marker with threatening notes. But we'd learned from their tactics. Everything was documented, photographed, and backed up immediately. We'd even started recording our daily routines, creating alibis for each other. If they wanted to escalate, we'd be ready with proof of their harassment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the parents at our meeting mentioned that her sister worked for a news station in a neighboring state. Not local news that the Chen family might influence, but a regional investigative team known for exposing corruption. We debated whether media attention was worth the risk. Before we could decide, events forced our hand. Oliver had been doing better. better. But one morning he woke up with severe stomach pain. The pediatrician ran tests and found nothing wrong, but Oliver kept crying and clutching his belly. It wasn't until I checked his overnight diaper that I found the cause. Someone had put something in his diaper cream. The cream I'd just bought from the pharmacy the day before. I rushed him back to the hospital where they pumped his stomach and ran toxicology tests. Whatever it was hadn't been enough to cause permanent damage, but the message was clear. They were willing to hurt my child again to stop me. That crossed a line I couldn't ignore. While Oliver recovered, I made a decision. I called the IT father and asked him to make our website public immediately. Within hours, he'd uploaded everything. Videos, documents, medical records, evidence of harassment, all of it. We sent the link to every parent we knew, every local Facebook group, every neighborhood forum. The Chen family's response was swift and predictable. Their lawyer sent cease and desist letters to everyone involved. They filed defamation lawsuits against Sarah, Lisa, and me. They even tried to get a restraining order claiming we were harassing them, but their legal threats felt hollow now. We had truth on our side. More importantly, we had momentum. Parents who'd been afraid to speak up started coming forward. Former employees added their testimonies to our website. Even some current staff members, seeing which way the wind was blowing, began quietly providing information. The wall of silence the Chen family had built was crumbling. The health inspector who'd given us the original reports finally agreed to go on record. He met with the state health department, bypassing his compromised local supervisor entirely. Armed with 3 years of falsified reports and our mountain of evidence, state investigators had no choice but to act. They arrived at Sunshine Academy on a Tuesday morning, catching the staff completely off guard. Parents later told us it was chaos. State officials documenting violations while Mrs. Chen screamed about lawsuits and connections. They found expired medications, including bottles of Benadryl hidden in various locations. The kitchen violations alone were enough to shut them down. But we weren't satisfied with just one location. Parents from the other Chen daycare facilities had been organizing too. When state inspectors showed up at those locations the same day, they found similar violations. The Chen family's entire operation was unraveling. Mrs. Chen made one last desperate attempt to salvage her empire. She called an emergency meeting for all Sunshine Academy parents, promising to address their concerns. Only about a dozen parents showed up. The rest were either at the hospital with their children or had already withdrawn them. She stood at the front of the room, still maintaining that everything was a misunderstanding, that a few disgruntled parents were spreading lies. That's when Maria, the former employee, walked in. She'd finally found her courage. Inspired by all the parents standing up, she placed a box on the table. Original documents she'd kept, including Mrs. Chen's own handwritten instructions about sedating children. The few parents who'd still been on the fence got up and left. Mrs. Chen stood alone in her empty daycare, her empire in ruins. The state health department issued immediate closure orders for all 3 Chen facilities. Their licenses were revoked permanently. The investigation revealed that over 200 children had been affected across all locations over the years. The scope was staggering, but at least it was finally over. The Chen family tried to flee. Someone spotted them at the airport with multiple suitcases, but they never made it onto their flight. While we hadn't been able to get local police to act, state authorities had no such constraints. They were arrested on charges of child endangerment, fraud, and operating without valid licenses. The legal process would take months, maybe years. The Chen family had resources for good lawyers, and their connections, while damaged, weren't completely severed. But we'd accomplished what mattered most. The daycares were closed, the children were safe, and the truth was out. Our parent network evolved into a support group. We met weekly, sharing resources for our children's recovery. Some kids bounced back quickly once the substances were out of their systems. Others, especially those who'd been enrolled for years, needed ongoing therapy and medical support. We fundraised for families who couldn't afford treatment, creating a community from our shared trauma. Oliver gradually returned to his cheerful self, though he remained clingy and anxious for months. His development caught up and his energy returned. The physical effects faded, but I knew the psychological impact would take longer to heal. We found a new daycare, one we'd thoroughly vetted, but I still felt sick every morning at drop-off. Sarah's daughter required intensive speech therapy and occupational therapy. The years of sedation had impacted her development significantly, but with proper support, she began making progress. Sarah became an advocate for daycare reform, working with state legislators to strengthen oversight requirements. Lisa's twins recovered more quickly, their shorter exposure limiting the damage. She used her research skills to create a guide for parents on warning signs to watch for in childcare facilities. It spread through parent networks across the state, helping others avoid what we'd experienced. The financial impact hit many families hard. Medical bills, therapy costs, legal fees, the expenses mounted quickly. Some parents pursued civil lawsuits against the Chen family, though recovering damages would be a long process. Others focused on moving forward, not wanting to spend more years in court. The Chen family's other businesses crumbled as their reputation destroyed any remaining credibility. The sister in the licensing department was removed from her position. The brother-in-law faced an ethics investigation. Their network of protection unraveled as each person tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Mrs. Chen was eventually convicted on multiple counts of child endangerment. She received 5 years in prison, though she'd likely serve less. It didn't feel like enough for the damage she'd caused, but it was something. Her husband and other family members received lesser sentences or probation. The other parents and I stayed in touch, bound by our shared experience. We'd learned valuable lessons about trusting our instincts, questioning authority, and the power of collective action. When one parent mentioned concerns about a different daycare, we all paid attention. We'd become watchdogs for each other. Some families moved away, wanting fresh starts in places without traumatic memories. Others, like us, stayed and rebuilt. The community center where we'd held our first meeting became a regular gathering spot. What had started as a crisis response evolved into genuine friendships. Looking at Oliver playing normally now, it's hard to believe everything we went through. The fear, the doubt, the intimidation, it all feels like a nightmare we finally woken from. But the scars remain, in medical records and therapy appointments, and the wariness that never quite goes away. The Chen family had thought their connections made them untouchable. They'd built their empire on the suffering of infants and toddlers, confident that no one would challenge them. They'd underestimated the power of determined parents protecting their children. In the end, that was their downfall. Our story spread through parent networks as a cautionary tale and a call to action. We received messages from parents in other states who'd started investigating suspicious daycare practices. Our website became a resource for those facing similar situations. We'd turned our trauma into tools for others. years. The empty Sunshine Academy building stood as a reminder for months before finally being sold. A pediatric therapy center bought it, turning a place of harm into one of healing. It felt like poetic justice. Where children had once been drugged into silence, they now received help finding their voices again.